Something is seriously wrong with the Australian landscape. The evidence that underpins this is seen in the way we manage our forests, soils, and water. At the time of settlement, Australia was an oasis. As clearly documented in the journals of the early explorers and painters of that period, the hills and valleys were forested, water ran in ponded waterways, and fertile pastures grew everywhere. So attractive was this new land that early Australian settlers brought in large herds of cattle and flocks of sheep. These animals overgrazed the landscape and provided ideal conditions for erosion and rabbits to flourish. At the same time, they cleared the hills and valleys of most of the trees that had stabilised the landscape for millennium. These cleared farms became dairy farms, which over time eventually disappeared as the regions became drier. Forests that are critical for the hydrological cycle and the production of rain became thinner and scattered till only remnants remained. Unbelievably, this tree clearing has not stopped till today. In some parts of inland Australia, like Western Queensland, mallee trees are now cleared for feed and breeding stock are fed cottonseed to stay alive. If notified, regulations are only partially enforced by local councils and state governments. Due to overgrazing and tree clearing, soil erosion has continued unabated, washing these previously high organic matter soils out to sea. A lack of regulatory enforcement has resulted in long-term costs that society has to pay for at some time in the future. Over large parts of Australia, there is evidence that the continent is progressively getting drier. The Bureau of Meteorology has accurate rain records since 1906 that indicate parts of the north are now getting wetter and most of the eastern and southern regions are getting drier. 80% of the population lives within these drying eastern areas of Australia. The Murray-Darling, which makes up 14% of Australia's mainland, and many other catchments are in a terminal state of decline. Too much water has been stolen from the rivers. Trees, fish and wildlife have perished, putting the whole ecological system and the economic enterprises that depend on it in peril. At present, there is no federal management of water here in Australia. It has been privatised and or managed by under-resourced state government departments with secretive deals in place so that water used by mining companies and agriculture is not registered and open to public scrutiny. A national department needs to be formed to manage this. Over the last 240 years, the removal of trees and perennial grasslands has sucked inland Australia dry. It is not by chance that inland Australia is getting drier. Droughts that last the best part of 20 years are not droughts. This is called desertification. Due to the continuing water stress brought about by desertification, biodiversity has now reached breaking point where it is getting almost impossible to sustain productive ecosystems that have flourished before. Biodiversity strategies to address the decline that don't include hydration of the landscape will fail. The incinerated forests from last summer are now regenerating and drawing large amounts of water from their catchments. For major towns and cities from the Queensland border to Melbourne, this may take 80 years to recover. This hydrological shift will add pressure on water supply to small farms currently supplying fresh food to Sydney and Melbourne. These farms are already competing with urban development and water bottling companies. Together with struggling grain growing regions, national food security is a real threat. The recent Antarctic blast and winter rains can only temporarily hide the fact that due to the degraded condition of our landscape, the country will rapidly dry out again in spring. Whether La Niña or El Niño, Australia needs to develop a long-term hydration plan. With COVID-19, there is an opportunity to invest in rebuilding ecosystem services that underpin our ability to be resilient and thrive. In part 3, we will discuss in more detail the practical solutions to the challenges we now face.